Please be seated. Just a word about the 100-year-old Abraham. In the Bible and in the culture of that time, not only in Israel but in other countries, if you wanted to make a person sound important, you would make them old. So Abraham probably was not 100 calendar years old, but that was a way to say he's important. And other people in the Bible, in the Old Testament, you'll read that Methuselah was 935 years old or something like that, and other people were 800 years old. It's just a way to say that they were important. Also, notice that Genesis says, and Abraham and Sarah were old. Yeah. And then they said, and advanced in years. So I don't know what old plus advanced in years means, but an interesting concept. So instead of saying people are old, you can just say I think it's nicer to say they're just advanced in years. So anyway, a couple of things that way too. And so also that little passage that we heard Jesus saying the laborers are few, is something you might think about as you are going through this search process. So pray for laborers that are willing to labor. So I can very, very clearly, with happiness, remember my first time I came to California. I was between 3rd and 4th grade in Ohio. My grandfather says he was coming out to California, Southern California, to visit with relatives, and he asked me if I wanted to go along. Well, of course I wanted to go along.
Silly question.
Silly question. But part of the caveat was that I had to earn some of that money to pay for the airplane ticket. Not that I earned all of it, but I can remember very distinctly. The airplane ticket cost me $98 round trip, which if you probably did the rate of inflation between 1950, whatever that was, and now, it probably was even more than people are paying airplane fares now. So it was a lot of money. So I remember that. We came to California, we visited relatives. We, of course, went to Disneyland. Disneyland had just opened maybe a year before that. So it was a pretty exciting thing for me from Ohio to be there. We did Knott's Berry Farm, which I kind of liked almost more than Disneyland in some ways. And I got to see the big wide ocean and play on the shore and in the waters and saw all kinds of new sea life, which I never had experienced before. So it was a very great trip. But the LA smog was terrible. It was really bad on my Ohio eyes. I was crying and my eyes were burning, and it was terrible. I mean, I'd be in the back of the car driving someplace and having wet compresses on my eyes because it was so bad. So anyway, so that was a beautiful trip. I never even thought about living in California. But look where I am today. As a person who really loves the outdoors, and as an adult lived within the bounds of Nicolet and Chequamegon National Forest in Wisconsin, lived within the bounds of the Tongass National Forest in Alaska, I never imagined, or did I want to, I don't think, ever imagine, that I was going to live in one of the most populous regions in the United States. In fact, when I first moved to California from Alaska, I can remember writing a paper for one of my graduate school classes, which was called The Loss of the Great Land, which was my way to talk about how homesick I was for Alaska and the great land there. So I never imagined I would be here. But look where I am. When I was in 8th grade, I was on a camping trip, and my father came out to the campgrounds with the Boy Scouts were camping, and told me my grandmother had been killed in an automobile accident by a head-on collision with a drunk driver. And I was traumatized by that. And so that death and that funeral process and everything was traumatizing for me. And I think it affected me so much on a emotional, spiritual level that when that first tickle of came to me when I was in high school. Well, you should go to seminary. You should be a minister. I said, oh no. I am not going to deal with death and dying and funerals. Mm-hmm. Then I went to college and I was introduced to the Episcopal Church in college by my Unitarian humanities teacher. And I discovered the beauty of the Episcopal liturgy and the wonder within the Episcopal liturgy, even though I couldn't go to communion yet. So I only went to church every other Sunday there when they didn't have communion. But I, with the liturgy and the prayer book, I thought, well, maybe I could deal with death and dying because there's a liturgy for it. You didn't have to make it up every time you did a funeral or whatever. There were prayers for the sick, the dying, etc. So, so one thing led to another. So when I again felt that tickle or that call to become a priest, when I was teaching school in Wisconsin, I thought I'd be able to deal with it, with the death. So I never thought I was going to seminary, but I ended up enrolling at Nashotah House Seminary in Wisconsin. So, surprised, I never imagined me, first of all, being a minister, second of all, being a priest, which I really didn't quite understand that concept at that time, but I never imagined that. You know, it's just full of surprises. Life is full of surprises. I guess we could say God has a sense of humor. Mm-hmm. You know, you think one thing and God thinks another. You know, and then this whole thing about death and dying, you know, I didn't want to deal with it. What do I end up doing? Hospice work for 25 years. Wow. And working in a cemetery now. I mean, it's mind-blowing.
See?
So, it's just you never know what God has in mind. So, it wasn't until 4 years ago that I was even able to return to pastoral ministry, which I really enjoy. So when you look back over your lives, I'm sure you can find examples in your life when you were surprised by God, and you kind of see now, and you look back at it, that God kind of had a sense of humor as He was playing with your life, so to speak. So here we come to today's lesson. So this is kind of a long introduction to today's topic. So when I was doing hospice work, I tried to do hospice work different than any other chaplain was doing. I think I was the first chaplain that I knew of that actually played iPod music for my clients until that caught on. And then I was one chaplain I ever knew that ever passed out pictures to their clients to put on the wall. And so I had this whole collection of pictures, and it was like if you were in hospice long enough, you would have a whole wall covered with art. So one of the pictures I gave people was this one, the picture of laughing Jesus. So I'm going to give you one too, not because you're on hospice, but because I love you. And it's not a green sheet, but it's a multicolored sheet. So I hope you'll find a place to put it.
We're going to share.
We are.
This is a nice picture. You're welcome. You want one or two back there, Andy? All right. So, the topic of today's sermon is joy and laughter, based on Sarah's experience of laughing when she was told she was going to have a baby. So, but the reason that I gave out this picture, especially to hospice patients, was because, you know, when you're dying, you need to think of Jesus as laughing. And you also need to have some sense of humor because, as we all know, laughter and humor are healing, are they not? Yep. And so this was my way of kind of making that happen, and at least suggesting that they do that. So it was later that I found out a little bit of history behind this portrait or something similar. I'm not sure if this is exactly the same one. It's a story about a man, and it's a man about living in Arizona. The man was super depressed, super depressed. He decided he was going to kill himself. So he went to the hardware store and bought a hank of rope, went out into Arizona, couldn't find a tree suitable for hanging. And he looked at those Sirocco what do they call those?
Yeah,
cactus. Saguaro cactuses, and he couldn't actually figure out how to hang himself on one of those. So out of desperation, he went to a Franciscan retreat house. And in the retreat house, this picture was hanging. And it affected his life so much that he decided that it was worth living. So he went on and he wrote a book. In 1985, the book came out, and you have to think of when I give you the title, you have to think of the time, 1985, and what was being said at that time. The book was Jesus Put on a Happy Face. Well, the times changed, and so did his book title, luckily. And now it's called The Joyful Christ. So it is indeed a very happy and joyful book, which most of this information comes from, about laughter in the Bible and in the life of Jesus. Now, we just read the very first time that laughter is mentioned in Scripture. Genesis, 17th chapter. We're right there at the very beginning, and we hear about Sarah and laughing, etc., about having a baby. Now, remember how that exchange went between God and Sarah? Oh, I didn't laugh. Oh, yes, you did laugh. And so this shows you again how God has the last laugh. Because the baby's name was Isaac. And according to some translations, Isaac means God laughs. Yeah. So anyway, it's kind of like another one of those examples. So anyway, early Christians, because our story is mostly Christian, early Christians were very joyful people. You read about in Luke's Gospel, Luke's Acts of the Apostle, you find all these occasions of mostly joyful happenings, going to people's houses, having dinners, and, joyful things happening. And they were focused on the resurrection. And they weren't, they knew about the crucifixion, but they weren't really focused on the crucifixion that much. It's not as much as the church began later to become focused on the crucifixion. And even today we have this strain of happiness that comes through us as Christians. What do we say at Christmas time? Merry Christmas. And Easter we say? Happy Easter. So it kind of comes through in those ways. But unfortunately, after our famous council at Nicaea, and the church becomes nationalized, so to speak, institutionalized, the focus of the church changed. It changed from this happy expressions to more focus on the crucifixion and the death of Jesus. And from my personal point of view, and I think a lot of scholars' points of view, the focus on crucifixion and death and sin and hell and purgatory, indulgences and all of that stuff was just a way for the clergy to control people. And but that's what's happened. And so what used to be a kind of a happy religion turns rather gloom and sour theology. So, well, you can look through the New Testament, and I don't think you'll find any place in the New Testament that says that Jesus laughed. It's just not written there. But good old St. John, at the end of his gospel, says this. At the very end of the gospel says, and there are many other things which Jesus did. If every one of them is to be written, I suppose that even the world itself cannot contain all the books that would have to be written. Okay, so John is saying there's a lot of stuff that didn't get written about. So what are some of those things that didn't get written about? I would beg to say that it was probably laughter. It was one of those things. that could have been written about. So let's think about that and the life of Jesus. Okay. Jesus loved little children, right?
Yes.
And we see pictures of Jesus sitting by a tree with children around him, some on his lap or something. You know, if Jesus loved little children, you don't love little children if you don't play with them, and you don't laugh with them, and you don't joke with them, you don't kid them, and all those kinds of things. I mean, that laughter had to be part of that interaction with those children. Do you think children would enjoy coming and being with Jesus if he wasn't laughing and playing with them? If he was an old sourpuss? I don't think so. Now, how about those thousands of people that would rush off to the desert to hear Jesus speak without even packing a lunch? You know, I don't think thousands of people would run off to the desert without packing a lunch to hear some boring, depressing, joyless teacher. I don't think so. At least I wouldn't. I don't know, maybe you would, but I wouldn't. So again, it's there, but it's not in our face. Jesus laughed. And if you look at the parables of Jesus, many of those parables and many of the little teachings that Jesus gives us are about joy, about celebration, and rejoicing with gladness. You don't have joy and celebrations and rejoicing and gladness without laughter. So just think of a few of these. I'm going to run through these. Think of the joy of the shepherd who has found his lost sheep. Think of the joy and the happiness as he tells about that story. Think especially even more about the father when his prodigal son returns. He runs out with joy and laughter and happiness and kill the fatted calf and do this and that. I mean, it's there in the parable. On the Sermon on the Mountain or the Sermon on the Plain, Jesus gives us the Beatitudes, right? Blessed are those who do such and such. Well, the word blessed in some Bible translations are actually translated as happy are those who do such and such. Think of that first miracle at the wedding of Cana of Galilee. When the party all of a sudden has 120 gallons of extra wine. So water was turned into wine. Think of the joy and the laughter that probably caused. If it wasn't Jesus laughing, it sure was the people around him. So, you know, it's there. Think of the little girl who was dead. And Jesus went to their house. And as he walked in, the people outside the house says, "What are you coming here for? The girl's dead." And they laughed at Jesus. They laughed at him. He goes in, he raises the girl from the dead. Who has the last laugh? You know. So, you know, it's there. Luke in the 13th chapter says something like this. All the people were overjoyed at the wonders that Jesus worked. So I'm kind of putting joy and laughter together. So all the people who were overjoyed. They're in John's Gospel. Remember we talked about John's Gospel and how John takes a lot of the teachings and lessons of Jesus and wraps them up into what's called the high priestly prayer in John's Gospel, which takes place at the Last Supper. So in that Last Supper discourse, Jesus talks about being a good shepherd. And that he has come to bring them, or us, abundant life. So doesn't abundant life include joy and happiness and laughter? Speaking of joy, I want to remind you of this green sheet.
Oh, yeah.
That I passed out in Ascension Day. Remember, we kind of broke down the discourse of Jesus at the Last Supper into 3 words. One. Joy. And
Go and do.
sit. Yes, right.
Okay.
So, One, joy, and scent. So, I'm trying to keep a theme going here. So we turn to the crucifixion, and before the crucifixion, the last hours of the life of Jesus. And he's again talking to his disciples around the table, if you prefer. If you keep my commandments, you will remain in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and remain in his love. And then he says this little line. I have told you this so that your joy may be in you and your joy complete. I have told you and have done everything that I have done so that your own joy may be in you and your joy complete. And then on the following verses, he says something like this. He speaks again of his death and says, because he's predicting his death, he says, I tell you solemnly, you will be weeping and wailing while the world will rejoice. You will be sorrowful, but your sorrow will turn to joy. You are sad now, but I shall see you again, and your hearts will be full of joy. And that joy no one shall take away from you. But your sorrow will turn to joy. You are sad now, but I shall see you again, and your hearts will be full of joy. And that joy no one shall take away from you. And then he throws this at us a couple more verses later. He says, ask and you shall receive, so that your joy will be complete. Jesus wants us to be joyful people. Jesus does all that he can to make us joyful people. And then in a prayer to God, Jesus praying to God, Jesus praying to Abba, he says this. Station break. Jesus says to God in prayer, but now I am coming to you, and while still in this world, I say these things, the things he's saying to the people around him, to share my joy with them to the full. We all know that Great Depression and sadness and fear descended upon the disciples after the crucifixion, until on a Sunday morning, the women who had visited the empty tomb came back to them, and as Matthew says, as the women came back to the hiding disciples, that motley crew, it says, the women were filled with awe and great joy. And they came quickly away from the tomb and ran to tell the disciples. Awe and great joy. Everyone we read about during the resurrection appearances of Jesus were filled with great joy. Even if they only spent a few moments with him during the resurrection appearances. Now Luke says in Acts there was like 5,000 people that saw Jesus during the resurrection. Maybe not. But every one of the stories we have, it talks about the great joy that the people had when they encountered Jesus in whatever the story it was. And then we come to the ascension of Jesus. And then after the ascension, it says the apostles went back into Jerusalem full of joy. Today, as you come to the table of the Lord for Holy Communion, come seeking today that joy that Christ would have you experience, that joy that comes to you as Christ dwells within you and you dwell within Christ within that moment of communion. So, Laura and I practiced a little bit before church. I sprung the song because I don't really do my sermons much before church time, so I don't have time to warn musicians what's going to happen. So I asked her today if she knows this song. And if you know it, you can kind of sing along. It's a song that we used to sing in Sunday school, church school, summer camps, and all that kind of stuff. It's called, I've Got That Joy of Jesus Down in My Heart.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so here it goes.
I think you should stand and really experience the joy. I got joy, 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 joy down in my heart. Where? Down in my heart. Where? Down in my heart. I got the joy, 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 joy down in my heart.
Where?
Down in my heart you stay. And I'm so happy, so very happy. I've got the joy in my heart. Yes, I'm so happy, so very happy. I've got the love of Jesus in my heart. I don't know how to play that part.
I got the love of Jesus down in my heart to stay. Amen. And joyfully, the sermon ends.